It was too big to be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was a heap of raw iron. But it is this hulking raw iron that has made the protagonist of Kentaro Miura's seminal creation such an iconic manga character. There have been a lot, and we do mean a lot, of cool, massive swords in anime and manga history, but none of them have had quite the impact as the monstrosity that the Black Swordsman swings around on a regular basis. The Dragon Slayer is not manga's first insanely big sword, but it certainly is its most important big sword from a historical perspective, because after Young Animal started publishing Berserk, unwieldy swords being wielded became kind of a defining trope. Zangetsu, Samihara, Yoru, the list of weapons inspired by the Dragon Slayer in design and concept is practically endless, but we're going to explain to you just why Guts' sword is so unique to him and so important for Berserk's story. So without further ado, this is Guts' Dragon Slayer. Explore! Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He doesn't use it as often as his crossbow or arm cannon, but when he does, it's a spectacle to behold. The introduction of Guts' Dragon Slayer. If you picked up the first volume of Berserk and stopped short of reading it after looking at its cover for some reason, then number one, why? And number two, you'd have left that scenario thinking Guts is a steampunk Robin Hood. And if you stopped reading it by page 20 because of how sadistic and brutal Guts was being, then you'd have thought the same thing, because he only uses his arm cannon and rapid-fire crossbows up until that point. He uses the former to get revenge for Corcus in the first pages of Berserk, and the latter to scatter the thugs from Koka Castle, whose master was the real target of his hunt. The fact that he literally manhandles a guy with an arrow sticking out of his mouth makes you think that this guy doesn't need anything else to take care of himself. But when Guts is jumped by a rogue thug, that's when you remember he's also been carrying a sword this entire time. The way Miura draws Guts in the first few pages of Berserk, you wouldn't be able to guess the size of the Black Swordsman's weapon even if you wanted to. It was also covered by his massive cloak, so it might as well have been as small as a tanto, like Kakashi's white-like chakra saber. If you're one of those people who falls in the categories we've mentioned above, then we can understand your obvious surprise when you actually take a look at Dragon Slayer in all its glory. The panel in which Guts swings his iconic sword for the first time is one of the earliest examples of the kind of masterful artwork that you would find everywhere in Berserk, as Miura refined his artistic process. As the Koka thug tries to ambush Guts from behind, Puck tries to warn the Black Swordsman of the surprise attack, but he is a step ahead of everyone. Guts brandishes the Dragon Slayer with his right arm and bisects his enemy with a single stroke of his sword, leaving a massive dent in the wooden floorboards of the inn and a stunned look on the faces of everyone within it. The Black Swordsman, having made his point, exits the premises after reminding the one thug he had left alive to warn his master of Guts' arrival. You can tell Miura really wanted to sell his audience on the guy with a massive sword gimmick early on, because the first question Puck asks Guts after catching up with him is if he should call Dragon Slayer a slab instead of a sword. But it's also evident that he put a lot of thought behind the use of such an absurdly large weapon of choice. The Dragon Slayer is way bigger than any standard greatsword in existence, and much wider than any sword fit for regular warfare, period. The inspirations behind it, a blade from the Gyuin Saga spin-off The Snow Queen and Kurt's sword from Pygmalion, while huge in size, were never wielded realistically. The former blade was 2 or 3 meters long, and yet it caused no imbalance while being used. The latter blade was being wielded by a child no taller than Erika, and yes, Kurt had superpowers, but if that's the reason behind him being able to swing his sword, then we already crossed the boundary of realism like 20 blocks ago. In interviews published in the official Berserk guidebook released in 2017, Miura-sensei stated that he wanted his protagonist to have a massive sword, but the physique to go along with it. He said that when he was conceptualizing Guts' design, he initially wanted to give him a traditional Japanese blade, but kept coming around to the Dragon Slayer as a better selling point. So he decided he would have his human protagonist be at peak physical conditioning in order to have him swing this heap of iron and for his actions to not be entirely out of the realm of possibility. Miura specifically wanted the Dragon Slayer to look like it could be swung at least once or twice by a pro wrestler, and given that he wrote Berserk in the 80s, we like to think he was talking about Antonio Inoki in particular. There are entire pages worth of fan theories that try to estimate the weight of the Dragon Slayer, and most of them come around around the average of 150 to 200 pounds. That estimate, while insane, might just be true, because Guts only uses his sword when he really has to. During his showdown with the Snake Baron, the only time he draws Dragon Slayer against the Apostle's thugs is when one of them charges towards him. Guts immediately bifurcates the cavalryman, horse and all, and reverts to using his rapid-fire crossbow to keep the battle at a range advantageous to him. Even when he was getting thrashed about Coca City by the Snake Baron in his released form, he first used the arm cannon to create an opening, and then used the Dragon Slayer to finish the job. Every subsequent use of the Dragon Slayer has seen Guts utilize the sword with utmost efficiency, cleaving through multiple targets in a single stroke, and without the clanging sound from the 2016 anime, or at least we pray for his sake. Because of the sheer size of this heap of raw iron, Guts can also use it as a shield, which was made evident during his fight with Zondark. The Black Swordsman was able to block every swing from the Pseudo-Apostle's blindingly fast battle axe, thanks to, number 1, the Dragon Slayer's size, and number 2, his innate skill as a swordsman. Mere power is not enough to be able to use a weapon as restrictive as the Dragon Slayer. You need inhuman skill, sharpened to the edge of madness, in order to make use of a butcher's cleaver like that. Thankfully for Guts, he had all of that and then some. Even with his ribs broken and his fingers crushed, the Black Swordsman was capable of cutting through the Slug Count's durable flesh with the literal grit of his teeth. Before coming face to face with the Count, he broke a pillar in half with a single sword swing, and mind you, he did this after nearly bleeding to death and doing a makeshift patch-up job on himself. Guts' insane strength, durability, and skill at arms, combined with his fluidic comfort and switching between the metal arm, the cannon, the crossbow, and the Dragon Slayer, practically make him a one-man army. But how did he become such a lethal killing machine? And where did he get this heap of raw iron in the first place? These are the questions we'll answer in our next section. An unacknowledged mentor and two lives that are two sides of the same coin. Why Guts can wield Dragon Slayer and how he found it. Following the conclusion of the Black Swordsman arc, which introduced us to the titular character and his dark nihilistic worldview, Miura shifted to the Golden Age arc to immediately give us some context behind Guts' ideology. The Black Swordsman was touched by death from the moment he came into his world. He was born from the hanging corpse of his mother, and he lay in the mire of her blood in afterbirth until a mercenary band found him and a woman named Shisu nursed him back to life. Guts was adopted by this woman and her partner, Gambino, and so he grew up, once again, surrounded by death. The life of a mercenary was a harsh one, and Guts found that out very early on in his life. His adopted mother passed away a few years after taking him in, due to the plague, and though he didn't say it out loud, Gambino wanted Guts gone in all caps. With nowhere to go to and no one to guide him, the young boy decided that he was going to do things the mercenary way, and live life by his own convictions. Yes, he was pushed into it as well by Gambino's negligent, borderline abusive parenting, but ultimately, it was Guts' choice to pick up his first sword at the age of 6. Yes, you heard us right. Guts has been swinging metal since before he could even realistically lift up a dumbbell. Because mercenary bands don't usually move around with children, he was forced to use a full-size sword during his training sessions with Gambino, and the motif just stuck. When Guts was 9 years old, he wielded a bastard sword for his first battle. In the years that followed, he switched to a longsword, and when he turned 15, he graduated to using a huge two-handed greatsword whose proportionality to his teenage body was quite similar to the Dragon Slayer's after Guts had acquired it. Guts had seen tragedy from the moment his life began, and the only way he kept himself alive was by his sword. Ever since he picked up his first sword, he has had a ritual of practicing his slashes 100 times a day. Given the fact that he has been fighting with weapons far bigger than him for his entire life, it's not shocking that Guts can swing around the allegedly 200-pound Dragon Slayer as if it were a bow staff. He's literally built different. But what is interesting is that both he and the creator of the iconic sword seem to share similar life stories. See, the Dragon Slayer does not officially become a part of Guts' arsenal until after the eclipse. Well, none of the weapons he uses become a part of his arsenal until after that infernal nocturnal feast, but we're straying from the point here. The only time you glimpse the Dragon Slayer in the Golden Age arc is in the first couple of pages of the first official chapter of Berserk. Miura draws a beautiful sketch of this massive heap of raw iron that reaches for the skies, as he tells us about the man who wielded said heap and the reasons behind it. The actual sword itself wouldn't come out for quite some time, over 100 chapters after we last saw it in Guardian Angels of Desire Part 6, but that doesn't mean Miura-san left us hungry all that while. He gave us a ton of delicious Easter eggs along the way, chief of which came in the highly acclaimed chapter Sparks from a Sword Tip, where Guts told Casca all about where he had been holed up in his year away from the Falcons. During his year-long peregrination, Guts had decided to stay with a blacksmith and his daughter up in the hills, situated a few days away from the holy ground of St. Albion. Every day he would wake up and train, taking Erica's help where he could, such as when he has her assist him during his log training, and nearly every day he would be crushed underneath the onslaught of wood, breaking his sword in the process. Erica and her father, Godot, were quite used to patching up their tenant, but what they weren't used to was him asking questions. As Erica helped Guts with his wounds, the future black swordsman asks Godot why he does what he does, and the blacksmith's answer hits a bit too close to home. Godot, like Guts, has only known one thing since he could remember being a child: the hammer. He was from a family of blacksmiths, so before he could think for himself or even walk, he was handed the most important tool in the family trade. And once Godot started striking the iron placed in front of him, he got lost in the art of blacksmithing, thinking only about how he could improve his skills and output. Soon enough, he found himself stuck in the body of an old man, and just like people who don't have a reason to live, Godot doesn't have a reason for using his hammer. But there is one thing that he does love about blacksmithing: the sparks. Whenever he strikes hot metal with his tool of trade, he feels as if he can see his life flash in front of him through the sparks his actions produce. This really strikes a chord with Guts, who had come to Godot's cottage seeking an answer to his own ultimate question: what was Guts' dream? Like Godot, Guts too had only known one thing in life: the sword. Ever since he could lift one, he had been swinging swords to survive the battlefield. Though his father wasn't exactly a nice teacher or person, Guts did learn how to fight from Gambino, so you could call his fighting skills his cursed inheritance. Every experience Guts has had in life so far, before, with, and after the Band of the Falcon, he had survived thanks to his sword. Heck, there were times when he couldn't even sleep without hugging it like a pillow or a favorite stuffed animal. So after hearing Godot's words about sparks and such, Guts decides that his dream would be to become a swordsman without peer. If fighting was all he could do, then he would do it with the best, and confirm his own position on the food chain. The first person Guts defeated with his new mindset was the arrogant young master of the Bakiraka clan, Silet, whom he comes across during a competition. But little did he know that causality was listening intently to his request for a harder difficulty level, because it decided to take Guts from competing in an arms contest arranged by a nobleman and drop him in the middle of a situation where all he would find are enemies far stronger than him. We're talking, of course, about the Eclipse. After Silet, the first enemy Guts faces in one-on-one combat was Wild. Call it fate, call it skill, call it sheer dumb luck, but somehow the 100-man Slayer managed to kill the Ape Apostle. The same simply cannot be said for the actual Eclipse itself, because the fact that Guts survived the ordeal is what has been giving him constant nightmares ever since. And when we say nightmares, we mean that quite literally. The Raider captain of the Falcons had already lost his sword to Wild, but during the Eclipse, he didn't even need a weapon to protect him, because he went feral with a literal horn. Guts stabbed and sliced his way through who knows how many apostles before witnessing the life-shattering act of Femto violating Casca. Completely lost to rage and despair, he passes out just as the Skull Knight saves him and Casca, and brings them both to Godot's mine. After going through a rather hectic night of fighting off evil spirits, realizing and adjusting to his new reality as a branded one, and being forced to accept the existence of the Demon Child, the only thing festering within Guts was a burning desire for revenge and death. He doesn't want to kill Griffith/Femto, he wants to annihilate all of demonkind. Having lost his left arm and right eye to the Eclipse, he was going to have more difficulty than usual in dealing with the Inhumans, but Guts still had the ingenuity of Godot at his disposal, and now that Rickard had joined him, things were about to get as tech-savvy as they could for a story set in medieval times. The former Falcon tinkered with some things he found in Godot's storehouse to create the prosthetic arm and crossbow that have become so iconic to Guts' design. They were in the middle of testing out this new equipment and a freshly forged sword from Godot, that the first target of the Black Swordsman's new peregrination showed up for his own death. The apostle that the 2016 anime called the Keeper of the Hounds shows up to Godot's cottage intending intending to finish off the leftovers from his feast, and with the first swing of his new sword, Guts realizes that his weapon was not going to be enough for his journey. Sure, it was sharp enough to cut open an apostle's belly, but it couldn't quite deliver a lethal killing blow. The apostle took advantage of this fact, and chucked Guts straight into Godot's storehouse, seemingly ending the fight there itself. But if he'd taken a tour of that shed with Rickard earlier, like we did, he'd have realized he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The black swordsman called out Godot for holding out on him and giving him a crappy blade when he clearly had something much better stowed away. He brandished Dragonslayer like a demon and brought down the Hound Apostle with terrifying effectiveness. After making Rickard promise he would take care of their leader, Guts embarked on his warpath, killing apostles and countless evil spirits night after night for 2 whole years. It was only after he killed the apostle named Rosine and survived his tussle with the Holy Iron Chain Knights that he would return the sword to its creator for upkeep. But it's clear that the sword had changed in all of this time, and we'll now explain why that is so important for the final stages of Berserk. Inhuman opponents need inhuman solutions. How the Dragonslayer was created and why it's so important to Guts' story. In Chapter 93, before the Hound Apostle shows up for leftovers, Rickard stumbles across the Dragonslayer in Godot's shed, and we get the story behind why it was created. In Godot's youth, a king sent out a proclamation for a sword that could potentially slay dragons. The lord that Godot was working for knew his skill with steel and put him on the job. At the time, the master blacksmith was still young, and he had grown bored of forging ornamental swords for noblemen. Their demands for excellence and refinement were the exact antithesis of what one should look for in a good sword according to Godot, because swords were meant for butchering men, and no amount of ornamentation could improve a blade's cutting edge. Godot was forced to forge the object of the proclamation as it was described. He created a sword capable of butchering dragons. Of course, because dragons aren't real, and because Godot was spurred on by a sense of defiance, he overdid by way too much, and the end result was the unwieldy Dragonslayer. He had to escape his liege lord and set up shop in the mountains near his ore mine because of how terribly his creation was received. Godot told Rickard that when creating a weapon, he did not like losing the essence of it, and yet that is exactly what he did with the Dragonslayer. It now served as a reminder of his failures, kept Godot's ambition in check, but Rickard was still curious. Could the Dragonslayer actually kill a dragon? Godot claims it could, if dragons existed in the first place. He says that dragons are called dragons, not because they breathe fire or fly on leather wings, it's because humans can't beat them. So what does that make a man who regularly chops up inhumans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? When Shirke and Sonia meet at the harbor in Vertanis, the Falcon's medium tells the young mage a fairy tale about an ugly duckling. If you want to know more about this story, or these characters in detail, then check out their origins on our channel. But the interesting thing about Sonia's tale wasn't just the fact that it reminded us of Rosine, it was also how she described the players in her life. In her story, Sonia was a kite, Griffith was a white falcon, Shirke was an owl, Charlotte was the duckling princess, and the Kushan were murderous crows. The apostles were dragons. We know this feels like a reach, but we don't think Miura added that detail to Sonia's fairy tale randomly. By the time he reached Vertanis, Guts' Dragonslayer had seen more apostle and inhuman blood than most soldiers see in a lifetime of warfare. The fact that Godot specifically said dragons are dragons because humans can't beat them ties neatly into how apostles view themselves as well. Most of the inhuman enemies that Guts is taking down often begin their encounters with him by berating his humanity and how pathetically weak it's made him. Apostles were a league above mankind in terms of sheer strength and speed, there was no doubt about that, but the one thing none of them had was the malice-tempered will of iron that Guts possessed deep within his heart. He makes wielding an absurdly large sword feel normal, he even does his 100 slashes routine with the Dragonslayer, and how that doesn't leave him in a coma by the 30th slash is still baffling to us. Intentions have strong meaning in Berserk, and Godot had created the Dragonslayer to kill the unkillable. Even though Guts is yet to slay an actual dragon with his heap of iron, he has killed several metaphorical ones and cracked the skin of a sort of actual one. After killing so many astral beings and spending so much time in the interstice with its wielder, the sword has been tempered by the malice of every entity it has slain and gained the property of being able to kill even profound astral entities that resemble polytheistic gods. Guts had used the Dragonslayer to wound the physical manifestation of Slan, and he is also the only person to have harmed Ganishka in his apostle form thanks to his blade. Godot's masterpiece became a certified god killer when Guts used it to slay the sea god. Although he hasn't killed a dragon with it, Guts was able to put a massive dent in the skin of a transformed Grunbeld, and the dragon apostle's skin is said to be as hard as corundum, the third hardest element in the world. After the advent of Fantasia, there is a dragon in the world for Guts to kill now as well, as evidenced by this beautiful spread in chapter 306. But that isn't what we're waiting to see Dragon Slayer run through. What we're really waiting to see is how Guts will use his mighty weapon to take down Griffith, because so far, he's completely failed to do so. When the Falcon of Light attacked Elfhelm, Guts wasn't able to land a single blow on Griffith, let alone harm him. All his swings somehow kept missing the incarnated God Hand member, and this broke him worse than anything else. Up until this point, the only thing that had not let him down was his sword. The Dragon Slayer, for better or for worse, had become a part of his body, and every time he wielded it, he knew he could survive whatever the world threw at him. And when combined with the Berserker armor, it made Guts unstoppable. The Black Swordsman could wield Godot's monstrosity one-handed like he was the Mountain from Game of Thrones, but move with 5 times that giant's speed and ferocity, if you could somehow believe it. It was thanks to the Berserker armor's maddening effect that Guts was able to wound Grunbeld in the first place, and it is this armor that keeps drawing out the Dragon Slayer's true potential. But in the face of Femto's divine ode, and the fact that he just showed up and stole Casca from Guts after he had just gotten her back, it broke the Black Swordsman entirely. Chapter 371 opened with Guts in the pits of despair, letting go of his sword willingly for the first time in the entire manga. He thinks that the one thing that he could rely upon for everything was also rendered useless in the face of his greatest enemy. But there could be another reason behind the Dragon Slayer's ineffectiveness against Griffith. The Skull Knight had once told Guts that following his incarnation into the physical world, Griffith had now become absolute. He was akin to an author writing his own story, and only those who lie outside his story can change its course even minutely. Chapter 337 showed us that this statement was true, because where entire armies and hordes of monstrous beings couldn't harm a feather off his cape, Rickert pimp-slapped Griffith so hard, assassins were sent after him. The reason why Rickert could do this is because he had moved on from the deaths of his comrades, and he recognized that the man in front of him was no longer the same Griffith he knew. Yes, Rickert was also not inside the actual eclipse ceremony, so he didn't know the trauma that came with living through such an experience, but our point still remains. The reason why we think his slap worked is because, as he said, his leader was the White Falcon Griffith. This Falcon of Light, savior of humanity, unifier of human and unhuman, was simply not the man he knew, and therefore, Griffith had no hold over him anymore. This is just not true for Guts. The first time he left on his peregrination through the darkness, Rickert tried to get him to stay with Casca and convince him that the Band of the Falcon was gone, but Guts steadfastly rejected this notion. He told Rickert to take care of their leader Casca, because he, as the raider captain, was going to go raid the enemy camp. Over 2 years later, and Guts is still raiding the enemy camp, and he still hasn't actually resolved his feelings towards what Griffith has done to him and the people he loves. Guts is still within Griffith's story, and that is why the Dragon Slayer could not work against the Falcon of Light. But if Berserk is in its final quarter, then the only way it can end is with a decisive showdown between Guts and Griffith, and that showdown needs to be a sword fight. Before his untimely death, Miura-sensei revealed that this is the direction he was taking his story in. Guts and Griffith have technically fought 4 times, and the Black Swordsman has come out victorious once. The first time was when Griffith subdued Guts after the latter was assaulted by Corcus and his boys. We can put this one aside because the Black Swordsman ran through multiple opponents, and Griffith entered the fray well into the dying stages of the fight. The second time was when Griffith defeated Guts and forced him to join the Band of the Falcon with his sheer skill and grace. The 100-man Slayer admitted his defeat and spent 3 happy years serving as the White Falcon's foremost beacon talent, but he was never the type to cling to another's dream. The third time Guts and Griffith fought, the Black Swordsman defeated his leader with a single stroke of his sword, but the 4th time they met face to face, he was reminded how pathetic his existence was in front of a profound being like a God Hand. Round 5 is incoming, there's no doubt about that. What remains doubtful is how the Dragon Slayer will fit into it. When Guts had to kill Rosine's elves, he squashed them with the flat of his sword. When he had to kill 2 targets at once, he used the momentum from his arm cannon to slash through enemies approaching from opposite sides. He has found a way around every problem the battlefield has thrown at him, except for this one. As we wait for Studio Gaga and Kujimori to make an announcement about Berserk's return, we can't help but feel as depressed as Guts, or as useless as the Dragon Slayer now that Griffith has Casca once again. We're hoping they give us some kind of an update soon enough, otherwise we're gonna have to make a few heads clang. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. The Dragon Slayer might have been conceived as an audience trap, but Miura-sensei has managed to turn it into one of the most iconic swords in anime or manga history. Because it is such a huge heap of iron, you don't see it come out too often in the story, which only means that when it does come out, crap is about to hit the fan at tornado speeds. Guts wielding the Dragon Slayer before the Berserker armor was impressive, but him wielding Dragon Slayer after donning the armor is inhuman. It's genius how even 220 plus chapters into the story, Miura found a way to keep his material feeling fresh, and it will be even more interesting to see how Kujimori and co. carry that legacy forward. But until we get some news on Berserk's potential return, let us know what your favorite anime sword is in the comments section down below. That's all for now, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.